Why do you read? Honestly, why do you read? I'm not simply assuming that you're a reader. You're here on this channel where we speak exclusively about literature. You clicked on a video titled, "Why do you read?" And this is not a rhetorical question. I will herein propose and go over some reasons why we might read, but this is a legitimate question. It is not simply for the entertainment, and I can tell you that because there are so many more extremely easily engaging and effortless avenues of entertainment. There are, here on YouTube, no shortage of cat videos, if that's your thing, no shortage of music videos, if that's your thing. You can find all of the lingerie try-ons and twerking tutorials that your heart could ever desire. I mean, hypothetically. So why read? It's not easy. You have to recognize that combination of letters that form a word, read the word, know the word, transcribe that word into an image that plays in your mind. That image that plays in your mind, by the way, how does it do that? We have no idea. These symbols, known as words, can be rearranged into any combination, novel combinations and structures which no one has ever spoken before in the history of humankind, and you, reading them, can know what they are talking about and transcribe them to an image in your mind. The small black and white cat cartwheeled on the surface of Mars. That is not a difficult sentence, but probably it is a unique and novel sentence in the history of the human language, and despite that fact, you can envision exactly what that looks like. That isn't easy. And I know that through 3 episodes, this series of The Weekly Reader, subscribe and like, by the way, has become something of a repository for the arguments of Stephen King versus Harold Bloom, and, perhaps unironically, this chat will include both of those men as well, because Stephen King has a very good quote on this very subject, a quote that comes to us from his book on writing a memoir of the craft, and it reads as such, quote, look, here's a table covered with red cloth. On it is a cage the size of a small fish aquarium. In the cage is a white rabbit with a pink nose and pink-rimmed eyes. On its back, clearly marked in blue ink, is the numeral 8. The most interesting thing here isn't even the carrot-munching rabbit in the cage, but the number on its back. Not a 6, not a 4, not a 19.5, it's an 8. That is what we're looking at. And we all see it. I didn't tell you. You didn't ask me. I never opened my mouth, and you never opened yours. We're not even in the same year together, let alone the same room. Except we are together. We are close. We're having a meeting of the minds. We've engaged in an act of telepathy. Not mythy mountain shit. Real telepathy, end quote. Now, there is a slight irony to that quote. As I am reading it out loud, you are not reading it to yourself, but the effect is much the same. You know what Stephen King is saying there. The telepathy the telepathy required in reading is real, and it is an investment. You have to do that thing. This is not passive. I used to struggle with this. I used to struggle mightily with this. Reading and writing have always been something of a part of me. I've never been able to explain it. I've never been able to put it on paper. I've never been able to really extract what that means about me, other than the fact that, well, if we're quoting the quotable, we get this from Ernest Hemingway in his Nobel Prize speech: writing, at its best, is a lonely life, for he, the writer, does his work alone, and if he is a good enough writer, he must face eternity, or lack of it, in each day, end quote. I've always been a loner, but that doesn't really explain it, because even being a loner, there are much simpler ways to pass time. Gaming, for example, much simpler, much easier to engage in. If you're here, I'm assuming that you have this same conundrum in your life. There are easier ways to spend your time than reading. But early in my life, I did struggle with this. Why do I do this thing? Why do I feel the gravity of literature, the gravity of reading? Why am I pulled towards these things? And I would like to read to you part of the prologue from the book How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom. The prologue itself is titled, Why Read? Bloom writes, "It matters if individuals are to retain any capacity to form their own judgments and opinions, that they continue to read for themselves. How they read, well or badly, and what they read, cannot depend wholly upon themselves, but why they read must be for and in their own interest. You can read merely to pass time, or you can read with an overt urgency. But eventually you will read against the clock. Bible readers, those who search the Bible for themselves, perhaps exemplify the urgency more plainly than readers of Shakespeare, yet the quest is the same. One of the uses of reading is to prepare ourselves for change, and the final change, alas, is universal. I turn to reading as a solitary praxis, rather than as an educational enterprise. The way we read now, when we are alone with ourselves, retains considerable continuity with the past, however it is performed in the academics. My ideal reader and lifelong hero is Dr. Samuel Johnson, who knew and expressed both the power and the limitation of incessant reading. Like every other activity of the mind, it must satisfy Johnson's prime concern, which is with what comes near to ourself, what we can put to use. Sir Francis Bacon, who provided some of the ideas that Johnson put to use, famously gave the advice, quote, "Read not to contradict and confute, nor to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse, but to weigh and consider," end quote. I add to Bacon and Johnson a third stage of reading. Emerson, fierce enemy of history and of all historicisms, who remarked that the best books, quote, "impress us with conviction that one nature wrote and the same reads," end quote. Let me fuse Bacon, Johnson, and Emerson into a formula of how to read. Find what comes near to you that you can put to use, to the use of weighing and considering, and that addresses you as though you share the one nature, free of time's tyranny. Pragmatically, that means first find Shakespeare and let him find you. If King Lear is fully to find you, then weigh and consider the nature it shares with you, its closeness to yourself. I do not intend this as an idealism, but as a pragmatism, putting the tragedy to use as a complaint against patriarchy is to forsake your own prime interests, particularly as a young woman, which sounds rather more ironical than it is. Shakespeare, more than Sophocles, is the inescapable authority upon integrational conflict, and more than anyone else upon the differences between women and men. Be open to a full reading of King Lear, and you will understand better the origins of what you judge to be patriarchy." End quote. Bloom goes on in this opening spiel of his book to say this, quote, "Value, in literature as in life, has much to do with the idiosyncratic, with the excess by which meaning gets started. It is not accidental that historicists, critics who believe all of us to be over-determined by societal history, should also regard literary characters as marks upon a page and nothing more. Hamlet is not even a case history if our thoughts are not at all our own. I come then to the first principle if we are to restore the way we read now, a principle I appropriate from Dr. Johnson. Clear your mind of cant. Your dictionary will tell you that cant in this sense is speech overflowing with pious platitudes, the peculiar vocabulary of a sect or coven. Since the universities have empowered such covens as gender and sexuality and multiculturalism, Johnson's admonition thus becomes, clear your mind of academic cant. A university culture where the appreciation of Victorian women's underwear replaces appreciation of Charles Dickens and Robert Browning's sounds like the outrageousness of a new Nathaniel West, but is merely the norm. A side product of such cultural poetics is that there can be no new Nathaniel West, for how could such an academic culture sustain parody? The poems of our climate have been replaced by the body stockings of our culture. Our new materialists tell us that they have recovered the body for historicism, and assert that they work in the name of the reality principle. The life of the mind must yield to the death of the body, yet that hardly requires the cheerleading of an academic sect." End quote. And so you have Harold Bloom's ironically meta argument on reading and why the academies do not hold the monopoly and the authority that they seem to be absolutely sure they do, that they are absolutely positive to tell you that you must follow. In the preface to this book, the chapter right before this, Harold Bloom begins his entire treatise on reading thusly, quote, "There is no single way to read well, though there is a prime reason why we should read. Information is endlessly available to us. Where shall wisdom be found? If you are fortunate, you encounter a particular teacher who can help. Yet finally, you are alone, going on without further mediation. Reading well is one of the great pleasures that solitude can afford you, because it is, at least in my experience, the most healing of pleasures. It returns you to otherness, whether in yourself or in friends or in those who may become friends. Imaginative literature is otherness, and as such alleviates loneliness. We read not only because we cannot know enough people, but because friendship is so vulnerable, so likely to diminish or disappear, overcome by space, time, imperfect sympathies, and all the sorrows of familial and passional life." End quote. Why do you read? Is it for information? Is it for entertainment? I contend that why you read is for transformation. Literature transforms us in ways that movies never could. Literature transforms us to depths that even music cannot, even if we do not recognize that about or in ourselves. Even for the third-grade child who reads during recess because he has no friends, what he is doing in the pages of those books is becoming more sociable in an ironic sense, because what he does through those pages is learn that aforementioned otherness, even if he has to learn otherness through nobodiness. Learning the viewpoints of other people inevitably and indelibly makes us more empathetic, and perhaps only through the mind of someone else can we ever truly know ourselves. And, as Nietzsche told us, finding yourself is one of the most fundamental endeavors of life. Now we're going to move to the poem of the week, and since we are here cursing the academies, cursing what it means to be so highbrow, I'm going to read some Bukowski. Bluebird. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke. And the whores and the bartenders and the grocery clerks never know that he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess me up? Do you want to screw up the works? You want to blow my book sales in Europe? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night sometimes when everybody's asleep. I say, I know you're in there, so don't be sad. Then I put him back, but he's singing a little in there. I haven't quite let him die, and we sleep together like that, with our secret pact. And it's nice enough to make a man weep, but I don't weep. Do you? At one time, Bukowski was not accepted by the universities, by the academe, because of his out-there style. Today, I think that Bukowski would be persona non grata in the ranks of the academe because of his subject matter. Maybe, in the strangely censorious age that we have somehow come to, even simply because of the language that he employed. The academies today have somehow forgotten that expression is not endorsement. And if we're going the straight out of academy route, we might as well head it off with some quotes from another writer who will not be accepted at the academic level, Bret Easton Ellis. This is how he starts American Psycho. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," is scrawled in blood-red lettering on the side of the chemical bank near the corner of 11th and 1st, and is in print large enough to be seen from the back seat of the cab as it lurches forward in the traffic leaving Wall Street, and just as Timothy Price notices the words, a bus pulls up. The advertisement for Les Miserables is on the side blocking his view. But Price, who is with Pierce & Pierce and 26, doesn't seem to care, because he tells the driver he will give him $5 to turn up the radio. Be My Baby on WYNN, and the driver, black, not American, does so. I'm resourceful, Price is saying. I'm creative. I'm young, unscrupulous, highly motivated, highly skilled. In essence, what I'm saying is that society cannot afford to lose me. I'm an asset. Price calms down, continues to stare out the cab's dirty window, probably at the word fear sprayed in red graffiti on the side of a McDonald's on 4th and 7th. I mean, the fact remains that no one gives a shit about their work. Everyone is leaving their job. I hate my job. You've told me that you hate yours. What do? Go back to Los Angeles? Not an alternative. I didn't transfer from UCLA to Stanford to put up with this. I mean, am I alone in thinking that we're not making enough money? Like in a movie, another bus appears. Another poster for Les Miserables replaces the word. American Psycho is a great exploration in writing from the standpoint that not everything in the book has to be important to the plot. It has to be important to the narrator. It is at times very, 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 very difficult to get through all of Patrick Bateman's musings about another person's wardrobe. That is not important to me. That is not important to the plot, but it's very important to Patrick Bateman. It is so important, in fact, that he simply won't shut up about where someone's tie came from, and that is important to our understanding of him. These material things mean the entire world to Patrick Bateman. To Patrick Bateman, a person is what one puts on their outside. As American Psycho is a first-person narration, that much is never told to us by a narrator. We, as the reader, have to put it together. Moving on to comments from last week, Will chimes in with this, quote, King is one I've struggled with, as I mentioned in a tag I did. His work is so diffuse into the zeitgeist, it's hard to not know his work even if you've never read any. There is an element, I think, whereby an author can put out too much, which has the consequences of diluting the pool, end quote. I will argue a little bit with that. Certainly not with believing that Stephen King's work is diffuse into the zeitgeist, but I will argue with the fact that an author can put out too much stuff. I don't believe in diluting the pool. Now, I say this fully cognizant of the fact that my two favorite poets are Emily Dickinson and Charles Bukowski, and basically no one has read all of their stuff because some of it just doesn't communicate very well. But to me, I believe that every author really has two separate canons. There is the canon, which is everything we know that they wrote. There is also the canon, which is everything that we believe should be read from what they wrote. Not everything has to be a banger. Ernest Hemingway, I'm currently doing a read-through of the Fincavigia edition with a discussion on each of the stories therein. Not all of those short stories are absolute winners, but there are elements to all of them from which we might learn something either about what Hemingway thought, about the real world, or about writing in general. And with the experience of reading Emily Dickinson, I have to admit that there are many poems that meant absolutely nothing to me upon a first reading, but the more I got into them, the more they meant to me, and I have included them, I have moved them up into the canon of Emily Dickinson that I think is absolutely essential. Likewise, I believe there are probably many Stephen King fans who believe that From a Buick 8 is every bit as essential as The Shining or It. And while I would not agree, their argument for why would be interesting. Will continues, quote, "There are some odd parallels we could make between King and Martin Amis. They both started around the same time, and I would say that Amis has the literary high ground from the contents of his work. However, King is significantly more popular, and, taking my own vexation at that fact out of it, will outlast Amis immensely as the overall canon of literature lumbers forward," end quote. I disagree a little bit with that last part, that Stephen King will outlast Martin Amis, at least at the surface level. And why? Because I don't think we have any idea yet. I think we are still far too close to both of these writers, and therefore surfing on their wake rather than their wave. And I want to bring in part of Todd's comment to contend with this as well. Todd said, quote, "If King weren't a genre writer, I don't think he'd survive. He'd be going toe-to-toe with the likes of Raymond Carver, and we'll see if he survives. But King is in a genre that isn't going to go away, and he'll be a lasting figure within that genre. Considered as an artist, he may not have mastered his Hemingway, but he has mastered his Alfred Hitchcock. I won't be forgetting that mother and child trapped in their car by Cujo anytime soon," end quote. So here we have sort of similar sentiments. They surround Stephen King surviving on because of his stature in the genre. But if you remember, last week's episode was asking the question, is Stephen King literature? As in, would Stephen King pass as being literary fiction? Can Stephen King fog the lines between horror and literary in the same way that, for example, Kurt Vonnegut seems to have been able to fog the lines between maybe sort of sci-fi, maybe sort of fantasy, and literary fiction? Kurt Vonnegut seems to be living on. But here's a funny little factoid. If I say Kurt Vonnegut, probably you think of Slaughterhouse-Five. You think semi-classic writing. Like it's on the verge there of being notable enough to be a classic work and being old enough to be a classic work of fiction. Slaughterhouse-Five, copyrighted 1969. Just 5 years before Carrie by Stephen King. 5 years. That still blows my mind. That is all I have for this episode. If you like or appreciate what I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button in order to stick around for more literary content. I hope to have you back for the next one.